Hello. The Divine Code reading for November 16th, pages 323 and 324. We are in the chapter Maimed or Broken Limbs. Topic number 2. As long as the animal is living, one may not cut off a hanging limb to eat it, even if the limb could not heal. Even if the limb fell off, it is still forbidden. It is clear that if it fell off while the animal is still alive, it is forbidden because of Avraham Hakai, as explained above in chapter 1. So, if something happens to the animal, it has an accident of some kind, farming accident, something to that effect, and a limb is torn, but it's not completely torn. It's still hanging on a little bit, even though most of it's torn off. It has the same it's still the same rules, the same halakha still apply to that limb. If it's attached, it's attached, and if it falls off, then it's considered, it's the same as any other limb. So if it detaches entirely, if the limb of the animal detaches entirely, then it's considered a limb detached from a living animal, as long as the animal is still alive. And if it's still attached, even if it's only a little bit attached, it's still considered to be attached. Even if a Jew slaughtered it by ritually kosher method and was still convulsing, the hanging limb is forbidden for a Gentile until the animal dies. If the Gentile cut off flesh from the hanging limb while the animal is still convulsing, the flesh is forbidden forever. So we learned earlier that in the case of a kosher slaughter, if it's kosher slaughter for the sake of Jewish consumption, a kosher species, kosher slaughter for the sake of Jewish consumption, and if a non-Jew were to cut off a piece of meat, that piece of meat would be permitted. It should not, rabbinically, it should not be eaten until after the animal is done convulsing, until it's dead. And then it's permitted. Whereas if this happened during a non-kosher slaughter method, or something that's not for the sake of Jewish consumption, if a piece of meat was taken off of the animal while the animal's convulsing, that piece of meat would be considered separated from a living animal and would be prohibited. So in this case, that hanging limb would be considered prohibited, even if the animal is going through all the kosher, the kosher slaughter, Jewish slaughter for the sake of Jewish consumption as a kosher species. That hanging limb would still be outside of the leniency. Kariti Paliti Uradea, chapter 62, explains that in this situation there's no leniency, as opposed to the case where one severs a normal limb from a kosher slaughtered animal that is still convulsing. Since a Jew is also forbidden by the sages to eat from the hanging limb in such a case. This is consistent with the Maharshal's position explained in the earlier footnotes. So, because that hanging limb would not be allowed for a Jew, therefore the basis for the leniency is that a Jew would be allowed to cut meat off of a convulsing animal. Now, this is not practical and nobody would actually do it, but if somebody were to do it, it would be allowed for a Jew, and therefore in that very narrow situation it would be allowed for a Gentile. However, because of the hanging limb of the animal, a limb that was detached by a farm implement or whatever, caused most of it to be detached. to be detached, the hanging limb would not be permitted to a Jew under those circumstances. I'm not sure. It doesn't go into that here. I'm not sure if a hanging limb would ever be allowed to a Jew. But definitely under this, in the kosher slaughter, animal still convulsing circumstance, the hanging limb would not be permitted to the Jew. And therefore the lenience, the allowance given to the non-Jew does not exist in that case. Topic number 3. One may cut a hanging limb from an animal for veterinary purposes or to feed one's carnivorous animals. And we would need to be concerned about causing pain to an animal, but that's not the same as the halakhic issues regarding limb of a living animal. If it's being taken off for veterinary purposes or it's being taken off to feed one's animals, that's permitted because it's hanging. It's not really of any usefulness to the animal at this point. It might actually be difficult for the animal. That's why it would be taken off for veterinary purposes. Though in those cases, it would be allowed to remove it, but it cannot be used for human consumption while the animal's alive. Topic number 4. If, however, the hanging limb or flesh could still heal in an ordinary portion, as an ordinary portion of the body. They got really good veterinarians that are going to patch this animal up. They're going to graft together whatever needs to be grafted, and they can get this limb to heal kind of sort of for the animal. In that case, all Torah authority agrees that it is permitted to be eaten after the animal was slaughtered or if it died in some other way. And that's the Rambam, Torah, and Shulchan Aruch Yeridea, 62:6. So there was a question, the Rambam opinion on this. And so in this case, the Rambam says that a hanging limb is considered severed. Most of the rabbis say a hanging limb is not considered severed. It's still considered part, even if it's only just a little bit hanging on. It's still considered part of the animal. The Rambam disagreed, but in the case where the limb is reattached properly, it heals properly. It's not detached entirely, but it's healed by a vet or just by nature. In that case, even the ones that thought it was consider it to be a detached limb from a living animal, would consider it now to be part of the living animal. Similarly, all Torah authorities agree that in situations below are not in the category of hanging or detached limb. A limb that has been dislocated, that is, the bone slipped from the socket joint where it is attached to the body, and it is still connected by the sinews. Shach Yeridea, 62:7. So in that case, the bone is separated, but the rest of the limb is still connected to the body. And the bone could be slipped back into the socket, or it could just hang there indefinitely. That's not considered a hanging limb because the flesh is still all there. Just the bone has been detached. B, a limb that has been crushed or pounded, but it can still heal. C, so in that case also the flesh and all that is still attached. It's just all mangled up, but it's still attached, and that's not considered a hanging limb. C, an animal's testicles that have been crushed or severed but are left hanging in the scrotum, and the scrotum is attached to the body. They are not considered to have been separated from the body since they do not decay. The Rambam, The Laws of Forbidden Foods, Chapter 5. Of course, that's a big issue regarding the hanging limbs. Is, you know, if you go back to that animal a month later, is the limb still there, or is it gone gangrene and it's causing all sorts of problems? That's a major issue. It doesn't go into much detail in the divine code, and I'm not sure how it fits in the halakhic literature, but obviously that would be an indication as to whether or not or it could be by natural thought, be an indication as to whether or not a limb is still part of the animal. That seems to be the area where there's disagreement about the status of this limb, but it doesn't go into that much detail here. D, if a bone is broken and it does not cut through the flesh and does not protrude outward, but instead remains entirely covered by the animal's skin, for it is likely to heal. And Beit Yosef Yerdea, 55, in the name of Ravad. In all these cases, after the animal dies or is killed, all authorities agree that it is permitted to eat from any part of the dislocated or injured limb. So in none of these cases, but in these 4 cases, would the limb be considered detached by any of the, you know, even the rabbis that are more strict in this regard, such as the Rambam, would not consider would consider this to still be attached, and therefore there's no issue regarding it. 5. Topic number 5. The following laws apply when a bone has been broken and protrudes outside of the animal's skin. So this would be getting more into the disputed area, and that's where it gets a little bit more technical. If the remaining skin and flesh could cover the majority of the thickness of the broken bone and the majority of the circumference of the broken bone, were the bone to be returned to it with the skin, and bone would most likely heal, and hence the limb is permitted. So we have a bone in somewhere in the animal it's broken, and it's part of the injury is that it's sticking out from the flesh. If it's possible to kind of yank the bone or pull the bone back into the flesh and have it healed, then it would be considered still part of the limb. The limb is still attached. If the remaining skin and flesh would not cover the majority of the bone in this way, the portion of the broken limb below the break is considered a maimed limb, and the difference of opinion mentioned above, that's topic 4, in the beginning of this chapter, still applies. So the issues before, regarding if the bone is broken and it's sticking out and it's not really possible, it's not workable to reattach it properly, there's too much damage has occurred, then there's that earlier difference. It would be considered they're calling it a maimed limb. It appears that the issues regarding the hanging limb would be applying here. The difference of opinion regarding it would apply in this case. In this instance also, one may follow the more lenient view. Thus, under these conditions, as long as the broken limb is not separated from the animal's body in its lifetime, after the animal's death, But if it is separated during the animal's lifetime or during the convulsions of the death throes, even the convulsions after Jewish kosher slaughter, it is forbidden, as explained in topics 4.2 above. So the same, that was the beginning of today's reading. The same rules would apply regarding the maimed, what's considered a maimed limb. The same rules would apply as a hanging limb. And apparently in this case, the difference is that in the hanging limb, most of the flesh has been separated. In this case, the bone has been separated in such a way that it's not healable. But apparently, the majority of the, or most of the, or enough of the flesh is still attached that it's not all the way over to being a hanging limb. But the halakha are still applied in either case. They apply the same in either case. Thank you.